She grabbed my arm in the airport terminal and said, "Act like my husband for the next 40 minutes. I was standing at gate 14 terminal C, 40 minutes early, for a flight I'd been dreading for entirely mundane reasons. A work trip, a client I didn't particularly like, a hotel room. I'd be sitting alone in that night when a woman I had never seen before in my life grabbed my arm with a grip considerably stronger than her composed expression suggested, and said, quietly and urgently, "Please act like my husband for the next 40 minutes. I will explain everything. I just need you to trust me for 40 minutes. My name is Julian Aldercroft, and I want to be honest about my first instinct because it wasn't heroic. It was confusion, followed closely by the particular wariness anyone develops standing in a crowded airport when a stranger suddenly attaches themselves to your arm. But there was something in her eyes, not performance, not manipulation, something closer to genuine, barely contained fear that made me do something I still can't fully explain rationally. I said, "Okay." Her name, she told me quickly, quietly, as we fell into step together toward the terminal's main concourse, was Ren Castellan. She'd spotted a man near baggage claim 20 minutes earlier, her ex-husband, Desmond, from whom she'd been separated for 8 months, following a marriage that had ended. She said in clipped, careful sentences, because of behavior that had escalated from controlling to something considerably more frightening in its final months. A restraining order existed. He was not supposed to be within 500 feet of her. He was, at that exact moment, standing near baggage claim in the same terminal she needed to walk through to reach her connecting flight, and she had, by her own admission, frozen. "I don't know if he saw me," she said, her hand still resting on my arm with a grip that hadn't loosened. "I don't know if this is a coincidence or if he somehow knew my flight. I just need to get through this terminal looking like I'm not alone, like I'm not an easy target, and then I need to get on my flight and I will never bother you again in my life. I'm sorry. I know this is insane." I looked at her genuinely frightened, doing a visibly enormous effort to keep her voice level, and her pace unhurried, and made a decision that, in hindsight, required considerably less thought than it probably should have. "Where is your gate?" I asked. We walked together through the terminal, and I want to describe honestly what that 40 minutes actually felt like, because it wasn't cinematic in the moment. It was tense, and strange, and full of small, careful choices. I put my arm around her shoulders when we passed close to a man matching the description she'd given me: tall, gray jacket, the kind of watchful stillness that made my own pulse pick up, despite having no personal stake in any of it. I made easy, low conversation about nothing, the way you would with someone you actually knew, because Ren had explained quickly that looking like a couple deep in ordinary conversation was safer than looking like someone visibly on alert. At one point, Desmond, I confirmed later it was him, from a photo Ren showed me on her phone. Once we were clear, walked almost directly past us, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his sleeve. Ren's entire body went rigid beside me, and I did the only thing that felt instinctively right in that moment. I turned toward her slightly, laughed at something neither of us had actually said, and kept us moving at an unhurried pace toward her gate. Exactly the unremarkable rhythm of two people who belonged to each other and had nowhere urgent to be. He didn't stop us, whether he recognized her and chose not to react, given the restraining order and the risk of escalating in a crowded public terminal, or whether he genuinely didn't notice her at all. I'll never know for certain. What I know is that by the time we reached her gate, Ren's hand was shaking slightly, and the fear that had been carefully controlled for the better part of 40 minutes finally broke through in a few quiet, unguarded tears she wiped away, almost angrily, as though frustrated with herself for needing to. "Thank you," she said, once we'd reached her gate and the immediate danger, real or perceived, had passed. "I know that was insane. I know I basically kidnapped a stranger's 40 minutes. I saw him, and I panicked, and you were the first person standing there who looked like you wouldn't ask 100 questions before helping. I had 100 questions," I admitted. "I just decided to ask them after, instead of during." She laughed, a small, exhausted, genuine sound, and for the first time since she'd grabbed my arm, I saw something in her face that wasn't fear. "Do you want to hear the actual answers? I feel like I owe you at least that much for the world's strangest 40 minutes. I did want to hear them. Her flight, it turned out, wasn't for another hour and a half. She'd exaggerated the urgency slightly in the panic of the moment. Or perhaps simply hadn't been thinking clearly enough to check. We sat together near her gate, and she told me the fuller version. 3 years of a marriage that had curdled slowly from attentive into something suffocating. Then frightening, culminating in an incident 8 months earlier. Significant enough that she'd moved across the country afterward. Rebuilt an entire life in a new city specifically to put distance between herself and Desmond. And was now flying back, reluctantly, for her grandmother's funeral, a trip she'd known. Going in carried the risk of crossing paths with him, since his family and hers remained tangled together. Through decades of shared history, neither of them could fully escape. I almost didn't come, she admitted, but I loved my grandmother, and I decided I wasn't going to let him take that from me too, on top of everything else he already took. I gave her my number before my own flight boarded. Not with any particular expectation, just the simple, human instinct, to make sure someone who'd been that frightened had a way to reach out if she needed to. She texted me that night. Once she'd landed safely and made it through the funeral without incident. Made it. Thank you for being a stranger who said yes to something insane. Not everyone would have. We kept talking after that cautiously at first. Both of us aware of how strange the circumstances of our meeting were, neither of us wanting to rush anything built on the adrenaline of a single airport terminal. What started as occasional messages became, over several months, regular calls. Then a visit, then another, the careful, unhurried architecture of two people genuinely getting to know each other, rather than performing a relationship that had started under duress. Ren eventually told me more about Desmond than she had that first day, the specific patterns of control that had taken years to fully recognize as what they were. The difficulty of leaving, the particular exhaustion of rebuilding a life in a new city, while still, on some level, watching over her shoulder. I never pushed her to share more than she wanted to. I understood, the longer I knew her, that the 40 minutes I'd spent as her fictional husband in an airport terminal had been, for her, a genuine crisis rather than the strange, slightly thrilling story it might have sounded like from the outside, and I tried to hold that with the seriousness it deserved. A year after that first encounter, I flew out to visit her for what had, by then, become a relationship neither of us had expected, but both of us had grown to genuinely want. Standing in the same airport, in almost the same terminal, waiting for her to come through arrivals, I found myself thinking about the version of that space that had existed for us, a year earlier, full of fear, urgency, a stranger's hand gripping my arm set against the version happening now, where she walked toward me smiling, unhurried, entirely herself, with nothing to run from anymore. Different terminal energy this time, she said, when she reached me, echoing a joke we'd made a dozen times since that first day. Considerably, I agreed, though I'll admit, some small part of me is always going to associate this airport with the most dramatic 40 minutes of my life. Best decision you ever made, she said. Agreeing to marry a stranger for less than an hour. Turned out to have decent long-term returns, I said, and meant it. Watching her laugh in a terminal that no longer held any fear for her at all. We're engaged now for real. This time, with considerably more than 40 minutes of consideration behind it. Desmond, as far as either of us knows, never learned that the man who'd walked past him with his arm around Ren's shoulders that day was anyone other than exactly what he'd appeared to be. A husband, unremarkable, unhurried, nothing worth a second look. I've thought, sometimes, about how much depended on that ordinary appearance, holding a stranger's willingness to say yes to something frightening and unexplained, and a few careful, deliberate choices made quickly enough to matter. I don't regret a second of it. Some of the most important people in your life, it turns out, arrive exactly the way Ren did, sudden, urgent, gripping your arm in a crowded terminal, asking you to trust a stranger for 40 minutes that end up mattering considerably longer than that. The end.